You may have. They grow in follicles. You ever heard of a scale follicle? Aren't any scale follicles. There's no possibility of a scale follicle. You see, this is the way the scales, in a very simple way, are arranged in a reptile. It's like drapery pleating. It's just one sheet that's folded. That's why when a snake or any reptile sheds its scales, do they come out one at a time? No, the whole sheet comes off together. When a bird sheds its feathers, does the entire feather and skin come off as one continuous sheet? No, they come out one at a time in pairs. Okay, so this would be like the new skin that's formed here. Where is the old layer? It's on top. Now, this is really interesting. The big set of clothes is under the little set. So you've got a smaller size clothes on the outside and a bigger side on the inside. So the orange then falls off, leaving the green underneath. It's kind of difficult to imagine the packaging that's going on there. But nonetheless, there is no such thing as a single scale. They are a continuous sheet where you have hard keratin, soft, hard, soft, right down the line. So let's look at scales at a lower power. This is the little boa constrictor again. It was only about 2-3 feet long. And the head of the snake would be down there about, I guess, a quarter of a mile. And the tail's up there a quarter of a mile or so, and we're in the middle. And we're looking at the scales, and the green arrow is pointing towards the tail. So this is the free edge of the scale here. Now what we're going to do, this is actually a sheet. This is not on the snake. At no time did we hurt a snake or a bird of any kind in this experiment. No animal was hurt. Anyway, we got the stuff after it fell off. What we're going to do is grab a hold of this edge here, and we're going to tip it upside down to the left like a page of a book. You with me? Okay, here it goes. Let's tip it over. Now the arrow is pointing to the tail up that way. Does that make sense? And the head's down there. And you could go in right there where that arrow is if you had a little tiny hand, and you could put it up in there, be like a coin purse. Some of you people in the cheaper seats out there probably can't see this, so we'll magnify it a bit. You get right up in here, and that goes into the scale, the free edge of the scale, tail being up there, now about a mile or two, I guess. So this is the way the scale is made. Now this scale is made out of keratin. And so is a feather, and so is a hair, and so is a dead layer in your skin, and so are your fingernails. But it turns out that keratin is a multi-gene family. There are many keratins. We're about to run out of letters in the Greek alphabet to just name them, and they're made on different genes. And this is phi keratin. Okay? So I'm sorry, the feather is phi keratin, and the snake is a different keratin. Getting ahead of my story here. Okay, what about the feather? Totally different. Forget about the drapery pleating. Now we're looking at a follicle. What is a follicle? A follicle is a tube that grows down from the epidermis, and inside this tube is a developing feather that looks for all the world like a hair. It's a cylindrical shaft-like affair. And all of the growth occurs down here. The cells divide. They die, turning into a feather, which is all folded up. It's like building the ship in the bottle and then pulling it out. And then this cylinder grows out, and you've seen pin feathers on chickens. It's got a shell around it. The shell breaks off. The feather then unfolds inside and swings out. There's all kinds of hinges in there. And you have a feather that's stone dead up here that grew from living cells down at the bottom of a follicle. So you see, there's a fundamental difference between a scale and a feather, which evolutionists blissfully ignore because they're so caught up, they're so blindsided by the reptilian origin of birds and the scale origin of feathers that they don't even think about this. If they did, they would have to abandon immediately any notion that scales and feathers have any commonality at all. Now, if I were to show this picture that I took through a light microscope to one of my medical students and say, identify this structure on the exam, they would all answer, hair follicle. Because we don't study feathers in the medical school. It looks sort of like a hair follicle, and I could go into all the details of what's similar, but unlike a hair, which is a solid shaft, this is a cylinder. So it's kind of hollow in the middle. So the feather grows out as a dead cylinder, and you're probably wondering, how does a dead cylinder with a shell over it turn into the feather that we see outside in the bird? All the cell growth, all the cell division is at the bottom down here. These cells divide and make this cylinder which slides right out of the follicle. Well, this is the way it looks. That cylinder would have a number of growing cells, dividing cells, and these cells, this is really complicated. You'll just have to kind of really crank up the brain here. The cells migrate around the cylinder to here. Then they make an elongated process that's going to form the shaft of the feather. And then from the cylinder at evenly spaced positions, other little filaments of cells grow out, and these march like soldiers around the cylinder to come over and get a ride on the lengthening shaft. And all of these little filaments go from the shaft side of the cylinder around to meet on the other side. Does that make sense? They would go from one side around to the other. But they make a long helical path so that they can be quite long. So if we had a feather follicle and we unrolled it, this would be that growth collar. This is the shaft growing up. Here are the little soldiers marching along and riding on the shaft. Each of these black structures we call the soldier is a barb. The barbs make up the feather vein. Now if we magnify the barbs a bit, here's a feather, this is the shaft, sometimes called a rachis. This is a bane, this is a bane. And here, right where the little circle is, we've cut out 3 of the barbs, or pieces of 3 of the barbs. And now we can begin to learn the names of the parts of the feathers. You're going to have to memorize this because you won't follow the rest of the lecture. The rachis is the shaft. There is 1 per feather. That makes sense? Okay. There is a vein on either side. They're not always symmetrical. But there is a vein on each side, a feather vein. That's what you make arrows out of, these veins. There's 2 per feather. Does that make sense? Or 2 per 1 rachis. And then these veins are made up of barbs. Those are the little soldiers that march around in the circle and join the shaft. There's about 400 barbs. It varies with the size of the feather, but figure 400 barbs per vein. Okay, it gets worse than this. Then the barbs have barbules, which means little barbs. And there's about 800 barbules per barb. And there are barbs that sort of aim towards the tip of the feather. They're called anterior barbels. And there are other barbels that aim towards the base of the feather. They're called posterior barbels. Does that make sense so far? They almost look like little micro feathers, don't they? The anterior barbels look different than the posterior barbels, right? The anterior barbels have, this is getting ridiculous. If you have too much, just let me know. We'll just stop. Each of the anterior barbels has approximately 20 hooklets, so it's estimated there would be, like billions on a swan. And these little hooklets are out here, and they're like a violinist's fingers, sort of like that. And what do those little hooklets of the anterior barbels do?